today is going to be on non-conformances, corrections, corrective actions, and preventive actions. And this is going to apply to quality and safety programs. So we're going to try to keep it a little bit general. Everything we're going to talk about, I'm sure that we can really make it applicable to everyone. We have a nice group of attendees so far, a lot of names that I recognize from previous webinars. So I'm very excited that folks are coming back. My name is Brian Kellerman. For those of you who have not come to one of our webinars before, I'm the Chief Quality and Safety Officer here at Kellerman Consulting. We've been around now for going on 9 years. We've done, I think at this point, over pretty close to 1,000 or over 1,000 projects dealing with either safety, quality, or a combination thereof. So if you have not been to one of our webinars before, I do want to start by saying that what the purpose here is going to be is to introduce more advanced topics or more advanced discussions of these things. The hope here is that you folks are not trying to learn what these concepts are today, that you've already dealt with these in the past. I don't want to sort of reiterate basic concepts of what is a non-conformance. We're going to break down different types and how to deal with them in this presentation, but hopefully you have a firm background on some of these things. I do want to point out right at the beginning here, to the right, Lydia, who has come to our webinars in the past, has already put a comment in the chat section. This is a topic that is very broad and somewhat generalized, and I cannot encourage you folks enough. If you want me to answer your questions during the presentation, as Phoebe is putting here, I will happily stop the presentation to answer your question. It is why I love these webinars so much, is I get to actually interact with you, even though you're not necessarily going to talk to me, but like I can see what you are asking. And if you have specific questions, if there are things that we're covering here that you want clarification, please feel free, and I will stop and answer your questions during the webinar. There are also some handouts. If you see where it says chat in the top right corner, next to that, we don't have any polls, but we do have handouts. And those are going to be for root cause investigations and some non-conformance templates to work off. We have hold tags and hold classifications, a whole log. So if you are interested in downloading those, please feel free. So again, use that chat, download those handouts, and hopefully that will be useful on its own. In the meantime, this is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about how to identify non-conformances in your operation. And then we're going to talk about how to address them. Because non-conformances happen all the time in operations, which we'll get to, whether we just need to do a quick fix, whether we need a bigger action, whether we need to reconsider our quality or safety program as part of how we're going to make a fix, whether we need to schedule preventive actions for the future, we really need to talk about what types of non-conformances occur and how we find them and what levels of non-conformances are before we really understand exactly what we need to do in all cases. We are going to talk about each type of those things. What is a correction? What's a corrective action? What's a preventive action? So we are definitely going to talk about that. We are going to address root cause statements and root cause analysis. How do we determine why something happened? Is that important to do every time? Is that something we can do some of the time? We're really going to try to link that to types of non-conformances. I will tell you, spoiler alert here, I'm going to recommend that we do root cause statements for pretty much all non-conformances, and we'll come back to that, but that's a time-consuming thing, so we'll talk about sort of considerations on where that's most important. Beyond that, once we have our written records of deviations or non-conformances, root cause investigations, and the corrective actions, corrections, and preventive actions, how we present those to management, the trending of those things we'll get into. And then we have a special slide here. One of the things that I wanted to go over in this webinar is when we go through a inspection or an audit and you have to do corrective actions and root cause statements, how is it best to do that? So I've actually written some examples and we can or examples of those statements so we can look at those and we can sort of break down how do you close those things out in audit. As I mentioned, we are not going to go over the basics of what is a nonconformance. On our website, and here we have a scannable QR code if you folks have your phone and you want to scan this code. You can go to our website, which is kellermanconsulting.com. We have free free episodes of training videos. We did an entire series just on CAPA, where we went through the basics of this. So if you are a little bit unfamiliar and you're thinking, man, I really wish we had some background, you are in luck. That background is available to you right after this webinar or anytime in the future, and you can go look at this. This is probably about 30 or 40 minutes total between those 6 episodes, and we get into the basics of what these things are. So for us today, we're assuming that you folks have a basic familiarity with what a nonconformance is. But as I work with folks in projects, the biggest issue that comes up is, when do I even start writing these things down? And when do I record nonconformances, and how many do I need to have? And as I've put on the first point here on this slide is, you have, for those of you that are in an operation, whether you are service providers or you are manufacturing facilities or processing facilities, there is something going wrong right now. Like as I'm talking to you, if we were to get up in where you are and walk around, we can start to find errors immediately. My joke with all of our clients that I work with is that the nonconformances start when the lights go on. And there are errors and screw ups, deviations, they are occurring all day long. And they only stop when you turn the lights off. And the only reason that they stop is because you can't see them because the lights are now off. If we have people entering into a facility or an operation, there are going to be errors. And it can become overwhelming to think through, like, how many of these am I supposed to write down? If you are writing down all the errors, you probably aren't going to have time to do your regular job, because you will just spend all day long writing down all of the unlimited indignities of life that come to you in your job. We don't need that. That is not what an outsider is looking for. That does not necessarily help your quality or safety program. So what we want to talk about is, like, how are we going to decide which ones to write down? And once we start writing them down, at that point, we can really start to delineate through whether we need corrections, corrective actions, preventive actions going with that. Lydia has asked, is a nonconformance the same as a deviation? That's a great question. And right there, we have different words, and I'm going to introduce some new words here for what kinds of nonconformances we can talk about, Lydia. So we're going to further muddy the waters. But a deviation usually refers to, in your process, like if you're making something, so for your specific business, when folks are putting together food in your operation, if there's something that goes wrong in the processing act, usually that's a deviation. And that's not necessarily a nonconformance, because a deviation is something that might be corrected. We do have some folks that are in meat facilities that are in the audience for this webinar, and they know sometimes when you are making meat products, it is very common for there to be a certain percentage of things that are not made correctly, but they can just be either rerun through the process or they're thrown away. Those are usually considered deviations. And depending on how often that happens, and depending on how much documentation you need in the program, you can record deviations and say, hey, I had this percentage, 10% of what I made today wasn't made properly. Every time we reran it through the process and fixed it. And so that is where a deviation might occur. A nonconformance is generally, we're thinking of violations of a standard operating procedure, things that did not go according to schedule or a predetermined action. And so we're talking about very broad things. And here on the last part of this slide, the 3 categories I want you to think of. So for a deviation, we're really thinking about within our process flow. That's something that is an expected or a normally occurring failure to complete operations just because of how difficult an operation is. So if I'm cooking something, not getting to temperature on a process might be a deviation that recurs regularly. I have thicker food or smaller food, thinner. And so the difference in the cooking temperatures might vary normally. In a situation like that, where I have thicker cuts that have to be rerun through because it didn't cook properly enough, that would be a deviation. A non-conformance would be somebody not setting the oven to the proper temperature. For a quality program, it would be the failure to do quality checks as opposed to the errors that occur when we're doing quality checks. Steve has said that he knows retraining is a bad word for CAPA, and he can't wait to see the alternatives. Retraining is something that obviously can be a corrective action, and we'll get there. We would prefer to change the program as opposed to just saying the same thing you've told that person who is just not listening another time. So we'll get there. And actually, that's going to be our descriptions of non-conformances. We're going to talk about when that's maybe retraining is not good enough. Where we have non-conformances, we can fit them into three basic categories of operation. We have applying to, for food facilities, we're talking about our ingredients, our WIP, or our finished products. For quality programs, raw materials, the products the end products. So we can have non-conformances, obviously, in process. Now, we talked about deviations, but if I don't follow the schedule, if we made the wrong thing, our favorite non-conformance, mislabeling, that is something that isn't a deviation. If we mislabel, that is a non-conformance for the day. And we are counting down the days in almost every facility until the next time someone puts the wrong label on finished products. We can have it in operation. So people leaving those hoses on the floor and not capping them, that is a non-conformance. That's not a deviation. Folks that are failing to put away tools after maintenance, those things are going to be a non-conformance. And then lastly, infrastructure, broken parts of the facility, things that were not installed properly, unsafe areas, those are also going to be non-conformances, or can be depending on how we classify them. So here's where I want to introduce something new. And I want to try something different here because, again, there are endless ways to talk about non-conformances. But where I want to start here today is to think about, in the terms of what do we need to write down for non-conformances? When do we write down non-conformances? Now, in a perfect world, all of them would be written down all the time, but that is not realistic. That is, again, not necessarily what folks are looking for in operations. Outsiders, whether they be regulators or inspectors, auditors, the same. What we find is that we want to demonstrate there is control of our operations. And writing down non-conformances, real quick, as I say, writing down the non-conformances is a key part of it. We have a question: is hand washing falling under non-conformances? If someone is required to wash their hands and they fail to wash their hands, and you see that someone leaves the bathroom or enters into a doffing area and then goes into operations and they did not wash their hands, that's a non-conformance. Absolutely. It's part of your SOP, most likely, I mean, almost all operations. Hand washing before you go into operation is part of basic hygiene. It's a requirement in food facilities to do that. And certainly most operations where cleanliness is an issue, you wash your hands before you go into operations. So yeah, not washing your hands and non-conformance, I would absolutely write those up. And that's one that I would write up probably every single time. In our classifications here, I have divvied it up. I've made a new type of a grid here to consider. Now, on the vertical column, I have probable and improbable. And that is another way to say likely or unlikely to happen. I didn't want to use the words likely or unlikely because those of you in food facilities know that if you're doing a hazard analysis, for those of you in non-food facilities doing quality programs, you might have a failure mode evaluation. Those things use likely to occur, and probable and improbable kind of gets to the same way without confusing the issues of talking about risks or hazards. We only want to talk about, hey, when a non-conformance, when something goes wrong, is that something that I should expect to have happened? Is it probable or likely to happen? Or is it improbable? Is it something that's just like one of those crazy things that I can't believe it just happened? On the horizontal line, we have foreseeable and unforeseeable. Now, something I expect to happen or don't expect to happen, that's one way of thinking about it. But something that I can anticipate happening is different than that, right? Because there's things that are likely to happen or probable or improbable that I don't see coming. and things that are probable or improbable that I see coming. And so we have divided it up, and I kind of want to go through in the next few slides. We're going to go through each one of these categories to think through them and think through what does it mean when I'm dealing with stuff that I know is going to happen and it's very likely that at any given moment it's going to happen, versus the things I can anticipate, but they almost never happen on one hand. And on the other, those unforeseeable things, the things that just come out of the blue. As we're thinking about corrections, corrective actions, and preventive actions, things that are foreseeable, those things we can easily come up with corrective actions. Now, Steve brought up training. Well, something that's foreseeable and probable, those things are easy to retrain on. But something that is unlikely to happen or is improbable, that's something that might not need a retraining because it's only occurs once every few years and it shouldn't have, it's basically something that should not happen. But if there's a non-conformance for something that is very that just should not happen, then retraining is probably not appropriate. Certainly for an unforeseeable event, that's going to be very difficult to focus on training. I have used these words in the middle. So for foreseeable and probable, we're going to talk about that as an error, but we can use synonyms for that. When something is probable but unforeseeable, I've used the term mishap here, but there's lots of synonyms, a lot of four-letter words that we could think of when those things happen, that it's just bad luck, things like that. For foreseeable and improbable, I'm calling that an anomaly. So those are things that may be stuff I could imagine, but man, I can't believe it. And then we have this force majeure. This is a big issue that we'll talk about. What happens when we have those sort of acts of God that just like, oh my God, this is something that I don't know why this happened. I may never have the answer. So a root cause investigation may not even be possible. Even if I could do a root cause investigation, if it's a once in a lifetime event, those things do happen in operations. And how do we think about dealing with things? So let's start with this thing that I'm just calling a basic error, foreseeable and probable. And again, like I say, that means we think it's likely to happen. It may only require that we do a correction. So as I mentioned, and as Steve talked about with training, this is the kind of thing where it's like, if I have something that is happening all the time, usually quality assurance or FSQA people or QC folks will just resort to just telling people, retraining them, please stop doing this. But a foreseeable and probable non-conformance are probably things that are occurring regularly. And when those things happen, we should write a root cause statement for those non-conformances. It would be best to write them down. But if we're talking about uncapped hoses in a facility in which there are hoses regularly, if we're talking about, I used to work in a facility where we had dry spices. It was cleaning up dust was something that occurred essentially, needed to occur every day. And it was something where at any given time you could go out and say it's too dusty out here. For folks that have lots of labels that are going in and out of rooms, there's constantly a struggle to keep those organized. And at any given moment, you can go into a room and say, this is a mess. And if we write down a non-conformance for that every single time, I may have 20 or 30 written statements about the same thing in a 1 to 2 month period. And at that point, we are not really achieving much other than pointing out how frustrating life can be when we have certain things that are not working out. Now, a corrective action for that is going to be something where we make changes, and we'll get into that corrective action versus a correction in a second. But if I have an uncapped hose and I put the cap on that hose and I hang the hose up, that correction may be suitable depending on the circumstance and depending on how often this happens in operation. If it's something that causes to what Lydia was talking about earlier, if we have deviations in processes, if it's actually creating a situation where our products or services are not being rendered properly, we need a corrective action. When we write something down as a non-conformance, we get credit for that as something that is a control measure. We've noticed something is incorrect. We are writing it down, and that's great. We recommend that that is done as often as you can physically, fit into your schedule. And the more non-conformance statements we have, the more evidence that we're finding things that are wrong. Whether we just perform a correction, whether we perform a corrective action is going to depend on, again, the feasibility of changing our system to correct things, or whether we're just going to take whatever we find wrong, fix it in that moment, and move on. Again, if I have had a maintenance person that leaves tools in an area where they're performing maintenance and they did not take those tools away, I don't know circumstantially if it happens, if the one time it happens, or in any given moment, I may just put the tools away and move on. I can write down, hey, tools were found to be out of place, we put them back. If this happens all the time, then we may want to ratchet it up and create a corrective action, add a new form, training somebody, again, who is forgetting tools. That may be appropriate 1 or 2 times to remind them to retrain. However, if this is a reoccurring event, Steve has mentioned a fishbone diagram. We'll get into the fishbones. I don't know that you need a fishbone diagram for someone leaving tools in a maintenance spot. What we might need is a checklist. What we might need is to have a extra sign off, a second person that comes through a spot each time maintenance is done if someone just cannot remember. Those are corrective actions that can be written into the program that may be a fix. As I mentioned, bringing wrong labels to the line. If I, as a QA person or QC person, find those wrong labels, I can write down, hey, I found the wrong labels. I told operations to grab the correct labels. We removed it. We did a spot check on what had already been labeled and saw that, no, we hadn't used the wrong labels yet, so we're okay. That might be the end of it. And when I write that down, that's fine. But in these examples, these are things that we do every day. So usually when I think about something that's probable, it's usually going to be involving things that are done on a daily basis or a weekly basis that are constantly happening. And so I can expect someday that these things are going to go wrong. And I can usually imagine what the problem is going to be. So as we move over here to the next category, the next 2 are kind of my in-between categories where it gets a little bit spicy here. But unforeseeable and probable is what I'm calling a mishap. And here, as I've written on the side here, so when something is unforeseeable but is probable, that means that it is something that is I didn't expect to happen, but it probably involves a normally occurring part of operation. So the examples here would be a forklift crashing into racking or into the walls, failure to complete a repair properly, maybe a service provider didn't complete the task properly or failed to fix it, and so now it's broken again. Those are things that are not necessarily likely to happen at any given moment. They're not something I expect. They are something that I could expect because they do happen somewhat regularly, but I didn't see it coming. When a service provider comes in to fix something, I expected that it's fixed. I did not foresee that person was going to fail to do that. It is only going to be something that shows up after the fact, and it's going to be very frustrating. So here Steve has mentioned that you could reassign a task. I think we're talking about the maintenance thing, to reassign to someone else entirely and verify that changing responsibilities. That is absolutely a corrective action, and that's something that is a change in the program. So when you change a job responsibility, you are going to need to make sure you document that potentially in a job responsibility that would come into your non-conformance statement, the corrective action of I gave this responsibility to someone else, and we may need to tinker with other parts of the program, an SOP, identifying who's responsible for something that may change. So yes, that would be a level of a corrective action. That's a great example. In this unforeseeable and probable example, as I write this down, this is where we really want to have those root cause investigations. Like I say, a foreseeable and probable event, I can just quickly write down, hey, new employee brought the wrong labels. They didn't notice we have products that have organic and non-organic, so they grabbed something and just didn't notice. That does not need a major root cause investigation. Something that is probable event but was unforeseeable. Those are perfect examples where a root cause investigation, why did we not see this coming? And what can we do to make sure that, hey, I cannot expect this to happen, or I did not envision this was going to happen. These are the things I'm going to put into place to prevent it. I'm going to give you a quick example. When I was a QA manager, we were making a specialty product. It was fair trade and organic, and we had purchased fair trade. One of the main ingredients, it was only 2 or 3 ingredients. The main ingredients, the purchaser from our company had purchased the correct version of that ingredient. When we were doing a routine investigation onto declaring fair trade, I noticed as the QA manager that the lot codes did not line up from the previous order. And it took about 5 seconds to realize that we were not using the correct ingredient. We were using a variation that was not certified as fair trade. It came in with identical packaging. It was recorded in our system correctly. It had been ordered correctly. The salesperson on the supplier side, so our guy called up the supplier and said, please sell me the fair trade version. The person said in the root cause investigation, oh, I just duplicated the last thing you folks ordered because we had previously run this product. What was not known was that the R&D team for the company had purchased a non-fair trade version of that product, 1 bag, 50 pounds. When the salesperson for the supplier duplicated the last order, they duplicated the wrong thing, and we ordered 100,000 pounds of the wrong ingredient. That was something that was probable. Misorders happen regularly, but it was not foreseeable, and it was something that was not caught at the receiving process for us because the bags were identical. You had to go onto the label and see a sort of shrunken word to understand that we had ordered the wrong thing. So it was one of the worst days that I have ever had in an operation. We did a root cause investigation. What the corrective action for that was, I mean, it was very, very difficult for us to come up with a reasonable corrective action. And to Steve's point, there was not a retraining for that. Nobody on our side had actually done anything wrong. The purchaser had purchased the right thing. The shipping and receiving folks had received what they thought in the system was correct and what looked identical to correct, and required only a very, very specific review of a label to catch it. We did institute an extra label check, but those kind of situations are brutal. In the last 2 examples we're going to use, foreseeable and improbable events. So things that I can envision happening. So this is the opposite of what we just talked about. Something that is likely to happen or probable, but I didn't see it coming. Here's something that I can see it happening, but it has never happened. And I really can't go around acting like this thing is going to happen regularly. What I have put in as an example would be like a roof collapse due to an ice storm, a vehicle crashing during transit. Those things are easily foreseeable, right? If I have an ice storm, it's very possible that it will damage my facility. But for those of us who live in cold areas that may have had ice storms happen every year and it doesn't cause damage to the facility, the one time that it does, we really need to write this down, obviously. We need to perform a correction. If we've got damage to the facility, we have to fix the facility. So that correction is going to be built in. In a situation like that, if it is something that is foreseeable that could happen but has never happened, do I need to have a corrective action, or do I need to have a preventive action? It is possible, but if it's something that has not happened before, and that's what makes it improbable, and it's really unexpected that it'll happen again, we can put a corrective action or preventive action in place, but that may not do us very much good. I certainly don't need to put a roof check in place on a monthly basis because one time in a decade there was a roof problem due to a specific storm. So in those instances, we definitely want to record the non-conformance. We definitely want to do a root cause investigation, and we also want to put in some kind of corrective action in place. Excuse me, some kind of root cause investigation, and at least do the correction. Whether we have a corrective action here is going to be circumstantial. If it is something that affected product, if it affected operations, then probably we are going to want to do that. If it's something that, again, affects infrastructure, then we may not need to have a corrective action or preventive action. And to go right along with that, I want to talk about these force majeures. And I wrote this for the force majeure, but it applies to both the anomalous events and the force majeure events. So where something is neither something we anticipate and it is something that is extremely unlikely to happen, is not probable, then we're allowed to say that. So if the example I've used here is a blackout in the city, somebody running into our facility. For folks who, you read about them in cities. I'm here in Columbus, Ohio, and people run their cars into restaurants. I don't think the restaurant is going to be able to prevent that from happening. That is just a really, like I say, a out of the blue, unexplained, unexpectable thing. Whether there is a root cause investigation, whether we put a corrective action in place for something like that is not necessarily applicable. And I don't think that an auditor or an inspector is going to hold you to that. You can write, this is something that we have fixed. You can write down the event, the day it happened. You certainly want to document whatever corrections were put into place for that. But if something has never happened before, and we don't think it's ever going to happen again, you can write that down. But here is my caveat to that. And this is true for both the anomalies and these force majeure events. If it happens a second time, that's not going to be something that you can do again. So we are allowed to take the, oh my gosh, this is an impossible occurrence, happened one time. Fine, I'm writing it down that way. If it happens next year, now all of a sudden that is no longer a classification. And so to get into and to lead towards our discussion of fishbone diagrams, 5 whys, these force majeure or anomalous events, they may not need those. Something that's an error or a mishap that's a major event and we cannot understand why it happened, sitting down and doing a documented root cause investigation using an organized tool is a great idea. Where we don't know why something happened, where it is not clear, and really no amount of investigation may ever uncover exactly why something happened, we can write that down one time. And we're going to talk about in a little more detail what needs to happen if you're going to choose that as a course forward. As I mentioned, because we have so many things that go wrong on a day-to-day basis, it can be almost impossible to write down all of the errors that occur. Where we're picking types of non-conformances that have a direct impact on operation. Basically, every KPI, every deviation that occurs in operation, and everything that impacts my ability to complete operations should be written down as a non-conformance, and it should have a root cause statement and a correction, and where possible, a corrective action. The things that are occurring that are outside of that, we do have the ability to think through, can I determine why this happened? Is this something that I need to document as something that I have to watch for repeatedly, because once it's happened, now I feel like it can occur over and over again? Or are these things errors and non-conformances that I don't really think are representative of our quality program or safety program? There are the result of forces out of our control, and we will look for signs that this could happen again. In my example of a vehicle crashing, yes, I might be able to do more maintenance on vehicles. We may do more inspections of the vehicles, but if somebody ran into my vehicle or ran me off the road, ran my driver off the road, that's not necessarily something that is going to have an effective root cause analysis, and I might not be able to address it to prevent it from happening again. So thinking through what types of nonconformances you have, there isn't a right answer here. There is not a, you have to write down every one of these types or you don't have to write down the others. There are varying degrees of issues that come up and how we want to address them and how we want to fit that into our ability to demonstrate control. That is a facility by facility or operation by operation consideration, certainly a day by day consideration. With that said, what I'm going to encourage folks, if you're thinking this through, is to be consistent. If you're really looking for specific types of nonconformances, and to be consistent is to say every time this type of nonconformance occurs, I want to write this down. Letting things slide, not writing certain things down, that happens regularly in operations. We see that a lot with our clients, where when we go out to do walkthroughs, there are things that are wrong, that spills that are not being cleaned up, tools are put away incorrectly, repairs that have not been made, and those things get walked past on a regular basis in operation. They are inspected during inspections or audits and just ignored. If that is an occurrence as part of operations, there are justifications for that. But what we expect to see is consistency, that we are towing the line for the most important parts of our operation and making sure we are writing those down, and that we're following up on those with those corrections and corrective actions and preventive actions. So as we move to this root cause statement, this is separate of root cause analysis. We are going to get to the 5 whys and fishbones in a second. But where we have a nonconformance, and whether we're talking about an error or a mishap, things that are probable to happen, things that I can either foresee or not foresee, I should include a root cause. Why did this happen? So what I need for a proper root cause statement is, as I put here, the day and time. When did this happen? And again, from Lydia's first question here, it might be a deviation instead of a nonconformance, but I need to log when it happened, whether it involved any of the classifications we discussed. Is it product-based or service-based? Is it part of the equipment? Is it a facility issue? And who is the person reporting it? I want to describe how it was found. Was this did someone in operations discover it and bring it to the attention of management or quality? Is it something that a normal GMP inspection of operations determined that this thing occurred? Was it during a internal audit or a customer audit or an actual certification audit? In any case, how it was discovered is important. The investigation of the root cause, and this really is, for my mind, the most important thing with deviations, nonconformances, whatever we want to call them. Half of the time or more, we know exactly why something happened. We shouldn't need to do a root cause investigation using a specific tool like a 5 why if we know why something happened. If it is clear cut and we can get to the core reason very fast, we can just write that down. And the method of investigation may be just checking documents to see who was the operator working a piece of equipment when a deviation occurred or a nonconformance. It may be which maintenance person filled out the maintenance form for something that was not properly fixed. That, at the end of the day, that might be enough for our root cause to understand what the issue was. Steve, as he's been listening, has been presenting some of the varying degrees of what else we can do. Well, in a root cause statement in which it is obvious what the solution is, whether it's retraining, changing a form, changing the responsibility to a different person, those things can be put into the actions or the corrections that we're about to make. And the reason why it happened might be this person is not appropriate for the job. We have a new person. If those things are obvious, you can just leave it there. The last 2 things to consider here are what led to this which again, if it's obvious, we can simply state that and be done. And is this something that has happened again? To speak back to the classifications we put into place, probable versus improbable, foreseeable or unforeseeable, is it a repeat occurrence is going to be really important for how we approach the fix. And this is where, as I was mentioning, if something has never happened before, then we can cautiously approach how we're going to address it. So for the 5Y and the fishbone, we have put up a basic diagram here. And as Phoebe has mentioned, there are just as a reminder, the templates for this in the handout section. Where we're going to use these tools is generally when I don't know why something has happened. If I'm looking at an occurrence and I cannot figure out what the series of events were that led to a non-conformance occurring, that is when I need to ratchet it up. The use of 5Y, the use of a fishbone diagram to guide us through asking questions, that can be very important. I am reluctant to see people going to this quickly for every non-conformance, because really at the end of the day, it will prevent people from actually going through the process. These are lengthy, they are frustrating in investigations to conduct. Generally speaking, to do these properly, a 5Y or a fishbone, especially the fishbone, you're generally going to want to bring multiple people in to perform one of these functions. So for the example that I gave of a misorder in which we as a company could not determine originally why we got the wrong product, since the initial investigation was, hey, we ordered the right product, we have it in our system correctly, and because of that, there wasn't a reason for the wrong product to show up. It was something that we started to go into the 5Y process. And in calling up the supplier, we were able to identify that, in fact, that salesperson was the one outside of the organization who made that error. Those things can be very, very tricky to determine. As I mentioned, for a probable and foreseeable event, you may not need to go through this entire exercise. And that is okay to do that as long as we've documented it properly. I think it should be acceptable for that to be the way we approach it. As we move towards how we're going to do some fixes. So we have our non-conformances, the different categories that we're kind of thinking through, whether we use a root cause tool to investigate or whether we can figure it out quickly. Applying the correction or the corrective action is really going to be something that is going to either be a quick fix or something that is probably going to take multiple actions, may take multiple days or weeks to get a corrective action in place. Where we are performing that correction, again, this is just a fix. So where I have something broken and I fix it, that's going to be a correction. As we are going through internal audits, as we're going through actual certification audits or inspections by regulators, oftentimes what we find is that the conflicts that occur during those events is that folks want to present the correction and the outsider, the inspector or the auditor, is asking for the further corrective actions that are going to be put into place in addition to the correction. And that's where folks oftentimes kind of draw a blank or get into a disagreement on what the approach is there. So if we are going to create a correction, and again, for the examples of unforeseeable or improbable events where, hey, I'm just going to fix this and move on, or something that occurs every day and it's just not feasible for us to put in a change to the system, and we're just going to have to fix, we have employees that might leave dock doors open when they're taking out the trash, or they're going to take doors and keep them open, put something in place of closing the door because they don't want to lock and unlock doors every time they leave the facility. There may not be feasible corrective actions, and so we may just end up having to go around and check those doors every single day. and just have repeated corrections to address these things. That, unfortunately, is the reality of a lot of operations. Where corrections are put into place, we still want to write them down and write the root cause where we can, and show, at least as best we can, that through these repeated corrections, we are actually addressing these things. But where we want to do a corrective action, where we want to, where we can change our situation or change our operations in order to address something, usually that's going to be either adding something to a schedule, so increasing the inspections, having extra people participate in an action to double check that things are done, changing forms to ask for further questions to make sure things do not happen again, and furthermore, adding internal audit inspections in the future to make sure there are extra inspections of things after the fact. Those are all the types of corrective actions that we should be adding in addition to a correction to make sure that things do not happen again. As we get closer to the top of the hour, the last thing that I wanted to discuss here is the method and manner in which that we usually write things out following an inspection and an audit to make sure that they are accepted. One of the key things that we find with our clients is at the end of audits and inspections, when a non-conformance or a NR or some kind of finding is made, how we present that to the auditors can basically be the difference between closing them out quickly and having a lengthy disagreement with a regulatory body or an inspector or an auditor. And so what I've put here are some examples. So I kind of want to quickly review how we write a root cause statement, correction, corrective action, preventive statements, where we find that these inspections or audit findings occur, how we liaison with them. So for the root cause statements, we want to explain what we did correctly as part of our operation, and then in the context of what is correct, what went wrong to create this non-conformance in an inspection or an audit. So what the example I've used here is for record control. We have a record control program. We do update our records, and those were presented to management. However, even though we have these controls, a new revision date was missed and not put on a document. When we're thinking about closing out root cause statements for outsiders, we want to start with what we have in place and then specifically identify what went wrong. Usually what we see when statements are rejected by certifying bodies are just, I didn't know, and we were unaware of this. Vicki has asked if this is on a recording. It is, and we will be releasing this, the recording shortly after the webinar. So you guys will absolutely have this after the fact. For the correction, when we're thinking about closing out a non-conformance, the correction is just what happened during the audit or shortly thereafter. So the example I used here was a failure to do a backflow inspection. The backflow prevention was inspected by a plumber on this date. That is a correction. For the corrective action, we are going to identify what part of our operation was changed in order to address it. So for that backflow prevention, I may include it on a following inspection, so GMP inspections or an internal audit for next year. In this case, I switched over to talking about door checks if there's an unlocked door. So during an audit, if an auditor opens a door, that door is supposed to be locked and it is unlocked, the correction, of course, would be locking that door. That's not going to be good enough to close out that nonconformance if it's written up following an inspection or audit. I'm going to need to show them this is the new form. This is the updated inspection sheet. I have added this to my GMP inspection for the month where we check to see that the doors are unlocked. Those corrective actions to identify this is the form or SOP that has been changed. That's going to be important for closing out a corrective action. So if the certifying body or the inspector says, show me a correction and corrective action, we lock the door following the audit is the correction. We have updated our forms in order to check that the doors are locked regularly. That is the corrective action. The preventive action, and this is something that also we find with our clients, it gets caught frequently in closing out audit findings. The preventive action usually gets flagged by the certifying body. What I want to suggest, the easiest thing that has worked for me when helping clients is putting a calendar invite on your computer and taking a screenshot for a future scheduled review of this nonconformance, the correction and corrective action. So if I have a yearly audit and my audits are scheduled for November and I get a finding during an audit in November, I'm going to, as a preventive action, schedule in October or September a review of this event and the documentation for the corrective action that was put into place so that I am ready in the future audit to make sure this does not happen again. And those calendar invites, the scheduled event to review, what we have found is that that is, generally speaking, an acceptable approach from really across all certifying bodies to make sure that you get those closed out. After we're done with our identifying nonconformances, figuring out whether we're going to write down corrective actions or just corrections or do corrective actions, adding preventive actions, we need to present those to management. And this is crucial. The presenting to management. Now, the day-to-day nonconformances that we're talking about, the ones that are always occurring, we may not present every one of those to management. We can lump them together and say, this is a continuing event. I'm having problems with my maintenance department. We are seeing tools left, and it has happened 3 times in 2 months. And so we're seeing a pattern that can be presented during a monthly meeting with management. If you have your weekly production meetings, you can present those as part of the weekly meetings. Every major nonconformance must be presented to management. Following an internal audit, all of the nonconformances must be reviewed with senior management. We've talked about that in our previous webinars on internal audits. When we are recording these things, we have to present them to management. As we sort of think through how we are consistently recording nonconformances, how we're identifying them, whether we're applying corrections and corrective actions, we really need to trend those, which is to say, count them up on a monthly basis and see how many we're getting regularly, because we need to identify patterns for that. As I mentioned, for the anomalous and force majeure events, whether we count those as part of the normally occurring nonconformances, that's going to be up to you folks from a circumstantial standpoint. But if I expect to see 12 or 15 nonconformances a month, if that's what we're seeing when we're consistently holding ourselves to a standard and recording nonconformances as they occur, I have been tracking the mislabeling of products, and we see 5 to 10 mislabeling events in a year. Through trend analysis, I should be able to see either that is getting worse or better. If something happens, when it comes to like leaving of tools, if that's something that happens on a regular basis, then I may say like we expect to see that 2 to 3 times per month. We have a very robust maintenance program. Guys are constantly going around fixing things and tools get left. But if I'm recording and trending them, I may find over time those retrainings or the other types of corrections or corrective actions I'm doing decreases the incidence of it occurring. That's something that we can give ourselves credit for in our quality program. If we are trending and we see an increase in those things that we have decided we're going to consistently track, that is something where we really need to intervene. We need some kind of major corrective action, a major preventive action. We're going to want to apply 5 whys, root cause investigation, the fishbone diagram, or the 5 why. We're really going to want to bring our team together and figure out why we're seeing an increase in those types of non-conformances. So as we get to the top of the hour, and before we take any questions, if there are any, I want to remind everyone that whether we are just doing a correction, whether we need to apply a corrective action and preventive action, we really should have root cause statements at the least for non-conformances. And as I mentioned at the beginning, how frequently I'm writing down non-conformances, what I would like to see for folks is consistency in how they're writing them down. There should be non-conformances since they're happening all the time. How I choose to pick which ones I'm going to be focusing on, I should be consistent. I should have root cause statements every time I write down a non-conformance. If I'm going to ratchet it up to a root cause analysis event using a tool, I can reserve those for major events. However, that should also be something that is consistent. Should not be willy-nilly, shouldn't just be sort of, I felt like doing a fishbone exercise today, so now I'm doing it. All of the non-conformances that you write down, those should be presented to management. And when we're performing an internal audit or an inspection, we should expect to find those non-conformances. As I say, they're happening all the time. A good internal audit is going to feature non-conformances. If I do an internal audit and I can't find the things that are wrong in my operation, I need to really reconsider how I'm performing an internal audit, because those going clean, I cannot think of a single internal audit I've ever done that was error-free. And frankly, I would be a little disturbed if I ever did an internal audit and there were no errors. For those of you that have inspections and audits, we should be looking carefully enough to find the errors that are happening, those non-conformances or deviations. And we should be, again, writing those down, writing what we did in the audit or afterwards to fix those, changing our system where appropriate to make sure those don't happen again, and then scheduling events in the future to consider what we did and whether that was effective. Now we have a few minutes left, so I wanted to leave a little bit of time. Obviously, folks did participate, which was great. If anyone has any questions at the end here, please feel free to let me know. Otherwise, just so folks know, we have 2 different types of training videos. On the left side, we have our food safety specific training videos. On the right side are ISO, our quality management system training videos. Those can be accessed on our website, or those QR codes also can get them for you. If you find you have any questions after this, we can be reached at the phone number here at our website. You can email info@kellermanconsulting.com as well, and we can follow up on anything. I don't see any questions, so we'll end it there. I want to thank you folks so much for participating, and I hope to see you again in the near future at our next webinar. Thanks so much.